Hello, everyone, and welcome to this public science discussion. My name is Diane Srivastava, and I'm the director of the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution, and I'll be your moderator for today. The topic of today's panel discussion is Earth's ecosystems in a time of global change. Today's event is being sponsored by the French Embassy in Vancouver and the University of British Columbia. We're going to feature 6 ecologists, all of whom are part of joint Canada-France working groups looking at this topic. These working groups are being sponsored by the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution and CIEE-CESAB, the Centre for Synthesis and Analysis of Biodiversity, sponsored by the FRB in France. So what do we mean by global change? Well, certainly it may seem that a lot is changing in the world right now, but ecologists mean by global change any widespread change in the environment. So currently, most of these big-scale environmental changes are caused by humans. So examples of current global changes include climate change, nitrogen deposition, urbanization and habitat loss, overharvesting and overgrazing, toxicity and pollution, and invasive species. So our goal today is to think about the impact of these types of global change on Earth's ecosystems and biodiversity. To do this, we've decided to divide our panel discussion into 2 parts. The first part will examine challenges related to the impacts of global change. The second part will consider the potential solutions. And the way we run this should be pretty fun. So each of our experts is going to present a lightning talk. That is a 3-minute burst of ideas and insights based on their research, which will be expanded with questions from a couple of the other panelists. So our panelists today include Dr. Isabelle Gounand, CNRS researcher from the Sorbonne, Dr. Bastien Mérigot, who's associate professor from Montpellier, Dr. Nicolas Loeuille, who's professor from the Sorbonne, Dr. William Cheung, who is professor from the University of British Columbia, Dr. Shawn Leroux, who's associate professor from Memorial University, and Dr. Nancy Shackell, Fisheries and Oceans research scientist at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. Let's jump right into it. So we're going to start by talking about the challenges of global change for ecosystems and biodiversity. And our first lightning talk is by Dr. Isabelle Gounand.
Thank you, Diane, for the introduction. I will start this discussion by talking about cross-ecosystem connection in the context of global change. So ecosystems are diverse in terms of habitat types and species diversity. And we are interested in maintaining this functioning. And for that, we have to acknowledge that they are not isolated. They are connected in diverse ways. For instance, salmon, after until life in the ocean, are bringing some nutrients in rivers, in headwaters during their migration for reproduction. And bears are fishing this salmon and letting some carcass on land, and this can bring up to 25% of the nitrogen used by forests in the neighborhood. And in the other direction, terrestrial insects can represent up to 90% of the diet of some fish. Another example is given by seabirds, which are fishing offshore and resting and defecating on island, and they are bringing some nutrients which are really important for terrestrial communities. And this also feedbacks on close coral reefs by leaching of nutrients. And animals can also connect very distant ecosystems. For example, when they are migrating, seabirds migrating between North and South Pacifics. And these connections are very important for ecosystem functioning, but they are also very vulnerable to global change. For example, warming can make some red berries, which are really appreciated by bears, maturing earlier, and this will disrupt the flows of salmon nutrient to forest. We think about also when there is land use change, with plantation replacing some mixed forest, it can decrease by 4 the flows of insects to freshwater fish. And biological invasion are also very important and a risk for this ecosystem connection. For example, rats brought by boats eating some eggs and chicks on the island can disrupt the flows of nutrients that these birds bring to islands, and they have been shown to impact negatively the coral reefs close to these islands. And the last striking example is given by this study where salmon population, which have exploded in the North Pacific following escape from aquacultures, have been competing for food with the seabirds, and it has been observed that it had a negative impact on this island functioning in the South Pacific. So this shows that what we do in one location can have very important consequences in other locations, even distant, and that this gives good arguments to say that we should treat environmental and biodiversity issues at a global scale. Thank you.
So thank you. Our first question is going to be from Dr. Nicolas Loeuille.
Thanks, Isabelle. So your main conclusion is that global change is disrupting these connections among systems. But I was wondering about the direct role of human populations in strengthening some of the nutrient fluxes. Especially agricultural activities can increase nitrogen deposition, and it can also move agricultural goods from one place of the world to another place of the world. So what do you think about this role of human population strengthening nutrient fluxes?
This is true that the example I've talked of was really indirect effect of humans on these flows through change in biodiversity. But it's totally true that we are moving directly nutrients all the time. And for example, with these exchange exportations of goods from agricultural production. If we think, for example, about California, which exports a lot of fruits, this constitutes a net export of nutrient and also of water, and these have consequences directly in aridification of California. And another really striking example is all over the world, generally the fertilizers used in agriculture, generally it's too much, and so there is a lot of leaching to freshwater systems, and this creates increase in these nutrient flows to estuaries, and it is creating all over the world dead zones in the estuaries, because it's triggering blooms of algae, and these algae are consuming all the oxygen and killing the aquatic community underneath. So, yes.
And Dr. Shawn Leroux had a question.
Thank you, Isabelle. You provide some really compelling evidence of the importance of connections amongst ecosystems, and with that previous answer, how we might be amplifying these connections. I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of how humans and human activities might be breaking some of these natural connections and impacts of these breaks.
Yes. Well, this this connection can be directly broken by our activities. I think first about, for example, if you think of a clear cut of a forest, it will directly break the flows of leaf litter to streams, which are generally in small streams, basic basic resource for the detritivores in these streams, and then of all the food chain in these streams. But yes, there are also very obvious ways of breaking flows. For example, the dams that we built on all rivers are really examples of how our activities are, in this case, for example, it would prevent the salmon to go to the headwaters and do their reproduction. So it's really impacting the biodiversity and the communities, and it has a great impact.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Bastien Mérigot.
I'm going to talk about how can we track global change effects on marine fish diversity. Global change encompasses different aspects, and if we focus on climate change, there have been some evidence that temperature can influence the composition and the distribution of fishes, but also lower trophic level. For instance, here, this map shows sea surface temperature changes across 3 decades in the northern hemisphere, with the American continent here and Europe. In some area, there have been some scientific survey that monitor community in terms of thermal affinity of species. And in area where temperature remains stable, little change in dominant structure of community were observed. In contrast, where warming was strong shift towards dominance of warm affinity species occurred. In addition, where area have strong temperature gradients, community change less than expected because species can move also vertically. But this kind of studies have been mainly performed in the northern hemisphere, while we know that warming is not uniform across the globe. So there is a real need to track marine fish diversity changes across different ecosystems, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. So in this context, we have created with colleagues a network of scientists that are interested in bottom-up survey to monitor fish diversity. And from this kind of survey and data collected, we can assess changes at different levels. The first level is the population level, so different individuals of the same species. For instance, here we show that the flatfish had his central distribution changed by 40 kilometers northward. And it's also interesting to assess the changes at the community level, meaning that we monitor different species, because through times we can have some turnover of composition while the number of species can remain stable because of immigration or emigration of species, again, loss of species. And so this feature can have a strong consequence on stocks, but also on ecosystem functioning. And in some area, they can have some strong need for an adapting conservation and fishery management.
Thank you for that talk, Bastien. Our first question is from Dr. William Cheung.
Thank you, Bastien. So most of the data that you show on the map from the scientific survey seems to be from the developed regions in the world, such as North America, Europe, and Oceania. However, there seems to be some substantial data gap, particularly in the tropics, as well as in some developing countries regions. So what are the implications for the use of this data to inform climate risk and responses assessment in relation to biodiversity considerations globally?
So considering other regions than those of the Northern Hemisphere have strong implications for better understanding of global change effects on fish diversity. First, it has been shown that warming is not uniform across the globe during the last 3 decades. So if we want to have a more complete view of the effect of climate change on fish diversity, it is better to consider also regions from the tropical area and the southern hemisphere. Second, if we consider other variables than climate, such as pollution or fishing, they also vary across the region we consider. For instance, fishing can vary in terms of intensity, in terms of a fleet, of gear, of kind of fishery for a given region through time, but also across regions. So for these aspects also, we have to consider different area, different region. And finally, assessing region in the southern hemisphere are very interesting for some coastal upwelling ecosystem, which are ones of the more productive in the world. And warming in this area can change wind and current regimes that in turn have an influence on the water stratifications and on nutrient phytoplankton, but also on the trophic network until fish. So for these different reasons, it is very important to consider other regions in the tropic and also in the southern hemisphere.
Thank you. And we have a question now from Dr. Nancy Shackell.
Yes, thank you, Bastien. Excellent talk. So research within nations can contribute towards a framework for transboundary management. But what are the measures that nations can take within their own borders towards understanding these ecological changes?
We can consider two main kinds of measures, one dealing with species monitoring and one dealing with management. About the first one, it seems very important that regions monitor both species of commercial interest, but also species of the overall community. Indeed, immigration or emigration of species at the local level can influence the structure and the diversity of the overall community. And this kind of ecological change can have important implications in terms of management. Not only management of resources, but also of the fishery in terms of fleet, in terms of gear, and in terms of port infrastructure. And overall, in this context, it seems very important that the different regions and countries can share information about ecological changes. And to facilitate this, it seems critical that they can make some common protocol to monitor species and ecological changes to facilitate the transfer of informations, as it is already done in some areas, such as between US and Canada, or between some countries in Europe in the Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean. And this also can lead to common agreements in order to share resources of fish for a better conservation of different resources across the globe.
Thank you. Our next lightning talk is by Dr. Nicolas Loeuille.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about evolution and global changes, and can we expect evolution to help maintaining diversity in global changes? So one possibility, of course, when we talk about global changes, is that species may move around to actually have a match between their local environment and their ecological niches. And that's the very idea of niche envelope models. But there is actually an alternative. So one possibility is that species are going to adapt to environmental stress. So here what you see, for instance, is that the population in red is actually decreasing, but then you have an adaptation, that's the blue adaptive allele frequency. And due to this adaptation, you can have a rebound in the population. And that's called evolutionary rescue. And it may actually save the species given global changes. So whether it's going to work or not is going to depend, of course, on the kind of system and the kind of organism you're talking about. So for instance, here on the left, you have data, experimental data on zebrafish. And what you see is that when they try to select fishes that have a tolerance to a high tolerance to warm temperature, it actually didn't really work. While if they try to select fishes that have a lower tolerance to a high temperature, it actually worked quite a bit. So they concluded, Morgan and collaborators, that there is no evolutionary rescue in this case. So such experiment can also be made on other organisms. So on the right, you have marine phytoplankton, and here their evolution is actually changing quite a lot the production to respiration ratios that you see on the different graphs. So with that evolution, you have the black line, and this black line shows that you have much more respiration when you have warm temperatures and you have cold temperature. So it means that actually this phytoplankton can become a less good sink, a less good carbon sink. But you also see that if phytoplankton has evolved first, which is the red lines, then this effect is mitigated. So it may have large implications for the carbon fluxes on the planet. What also interests me is that evolutionary rescue can interact with community structure. So for instance, if you imagine two species, and if you have competition between the two species, then it's quite possible that the one that has a very efficient evolutionary rescue is going to affect strongly the other one. So for instance, if you think in B or C, that the two species are in competition or predation, it may very be that the species that evolve fast kill the other species. So that means that we can't really expect that evolution is going to maintain higher diversity. It may actually be sometimes the reverse.
Thank you. Our first question is going to come from Dr. Isabelle Gounand.
Thank you, Nicolas, for your talk. I was wondering, on your last slide, you are talking on about the negative effect of interaction, but on evolutionary rescue. But do you have an example in mind where it can be the reverse, and you can have positive effects of interaction on this evolutionary rescue?
Yeah, so I took the example of competition and predation, but if I were to take the example of a positive interaction, for example, a mutualism or facilitation processes, then you can expect that evolutionary rescue is not only going to help the species, but also help the interactors. So if you imagine evolutionary rescue, for instance, in a nurse plant species, it may actually help the diversity in the ecosystem globally. But also my point is that if you have complex networks, maybe evolutionary rescue may reshuffle the interactions within the network in complex ways. And it may actually be a source of uncertainty, which is a reason why it's a challenge. So I think it's actually quite complex, but what it tells us is that we should really account for instance, genetic variability, expected level of evolvability in the different species, to try and understand how future ecological networks may be reshuffled and species affected.
Thank you. And our second question will come from Dr. Nancy Shackell.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicolas. It was really fascinating to find out how this all these rules are coming about the potential for evolutionary response. And I wondered if you could expand on the conditions for evolutionary rescue, and particular the role of body size and generation time.
Yes, so there is quite a bit of work on theoretical work on conditions of evolutionary rescue, and there is also now quite a bit of experiments on possibility or not of evolutionary rescue. So there are some parts on which there is a consensus. So one is genetic variability. So higher genetic variability means more evolutionary rescue. Strength of the disturbance. So if the disturbance is too fast or too strong, then it's going to decrease the possibility of evolutionary rescue. And also population size. If population size is high, then you have more possibility of evolutionary rescue because they can absorb more disturbances before crashing. So some of these are correlated with body size. So for instance, typically populations of organisms that have small body size are usually smaller. They have faster generations and accumulate more mutations and more genetic variability. I mean, that's of course a scheme, but it's a general trend. And generation time should also play a role. I mean, if you have fast generations, you usually have these larger populations and you can have more reproductive events and maintain higher genetic diversity within the population. So it's expected that it's going to favor evolutionary rescue. So many of the best examples of evolutionary rescue are actually from small world, like bacteria evolving in response to drugs, or effects of pesticide resistance in various insects, for instance.
Thanks. And so what we've heard so far are some really interesting examples of how complex the effects of global change can be on both ecosystems and the species within them. What we're going to do now is shift gears slightly, and we're going to start talking about potential solutions. And our very first speaker in this second half is going to be Dr. William Cheung.
Thank you very much. Today, what I'm going to talk about is how sustainable fisheries can be an important part of climate solution. Essentially, I'll be talking about how we can kill two birds with one stone, or actually more preferably, how we can save two fish with one hand. We know that climate change and global change are affecting the oceans. Greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide are going into the oceans, as well as the temperatures that we generated are all changing ocean conditions, are resulting in ocean warming, ocean deoxygenation, and other things that the oceans are changing. We also know that marine biodiversity, marine life, and the habitats they are dependent on are all related to the ocean conditions. So when these ocean condition changes, marine biodiversity will also be impacted. So for example, we are already seeing fish stocks being affected by ocean warming. Their distribution is changing. We see the coral reefs are being impacted because of coral bleaching events driven by marine heat waves. All of this will then have direct impacts on human society because human populations are tightly linked to the oceans. We depends on the oceans for seafood, and many coastal communities actually use seafood as one of the major sources of nutrients, protein or omega-3 fatty acids, iron, calcium. So without seafood, their health will be impacted. And millions of people in the world, their livelihood will be impacted as well. Decreasing, or there is a changes in the distributions or abundance of important marine resources. Also, we develop our cultures around the oceans too, and particularly for some coastal communities, such as those in British Columbia, in where I am staying right now. We have coastal First Nation or Indigenous peoples that have the whole part of their culture developed around the oceans. The use of seafood and the use of some of the species in their cultural ceremony. So, changes in the oceans and the impacts will be a big things for these people. But how can we deal with that? We know that the ocean is already doing a good job in helping us to solve the climate problems. The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, and doing so, some of the small organisms in the oceans we call planktons use carbon dioxide as the through photosynthesis to produce biomass that would then fuel the whole food chain. And ultimately, the big fish that we see in the ocean, such as sharks, tunas, and billfish, are dependent on these production. And the biomass that they accumulate when they die and sink to the sea bottom carry the carbon dioxide that is from the atmosphere. So meaning that it actually helps us to extract and sequester some of the carbon dioxide that we emitted to the ocean seafloor that will stay there for a long time. However, with decades of overfishing, we are really reducing this biomass of large pelagic predators, and thus reducing the capacity of the oceans to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through these large predators. And more importantly, a lot of these fisheries are not sustainable. They are also even not financially viable without the support by government subsidies. By having sustainable fisheries to conserve these large ocean predators, we can maintain and enhance the capacity of the ocean through these large ocean predators to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. What it means is that it requires us to remove harmful subsidies that support these unsustainable fishing activities. We need effective fisheries management. We also need to rebuild some of the overexploited fish stocks, particularly for these large ocean predators in this case. And there are also things that you can do too. You can support government and policy to reduce harmful subsidies, as well as those policies that promote sustainable fisheries management. You can choose to consume seafood that are sustainably sourced, and right now there are lots of information out there in the internet or public domain that indicate what seafood are sustainably caught. And more generally, be ocean literate to learn about the oceans. Our knowledge about our oceans is ever increasing, and also the ways that you can help the oceans and fish stocks are also improving as well. So try to actively learn what is going on about the ocean. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our first question is going to come from Dr. Bastien Mérigot.
Thank you, William, for your presentation. Fishing is also known to imbalance trophic network, which may lead to a decreasing in primary producer, which have a major contribution to carbon sequestration. And are there any quantification of such indirect cascading effects on the overall sea sequestration on such modified trophic network?
Thank you for your question, Bastien. I think that you point to an important knowledge gap in understanding how the oceans through the ecosystems are related to carbon sequestrations, and how the influence of changes in the food web, marine food web, will affect that level of capacity. We know that a large part of the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide is through the chemical pathways, where the oceans is absorb the carbon dioxide directly through dissolution. But then another pathway that is more helping with this, the talk that I just presented provide with one pathway where these carbons can be absorbed from the atmosphere to the ecosystems and then stored within the oceans. But then how the whole marine food webs would affect that capacity, particularly when human activities are also influencing the ecosystem, like fishing's effects on different trophic levels, or how pollutions or habitat damage are affecting ecosystems, and how that then ultimately affect that capacity, biological capacity of the oceans to absorb and store carbon dioxide is still a big part, a knowledge gap. So I cannot answer the questions directly, but then I think that is one important information and knowledge gap that the scientific communities are currently trying to address.
Thanks. And Dr. Isabelle Gounand had a question.
Yes, thank you, William, for your talk. I was wondering, among other solutions to sequestrate carbon by the ocean, people have suggested that we should enrich some poor nutrient zone pelagic zone to foster the primary productivity and then the sequestration by carbon. What do you think about that kind of solution? Is it something complementary to what you propose?
Thank you very much for the questions. So the what I talk about in my talk is a solution that is based on the natural capacities of the ocean. So what we are trying to do, what we talk about is to protect and rebuild that capacity of the oceans to support that. But then colleagues and people have been thinking about human intervention, enhance or intervention that add to that kind of natural capacity, such as fertilizing the oceans to make it more productive so that more carbon can be captured and then stored in the oceans. A couple of years ago, that we did a analysis that looked at the effectiveness and the risk associated with all of these potential interventions. And one of the key conclusions is that the natural capacity of the oceans to store carbon is definitely an effective way in terms of both achieving the help supporting the carbon sequestration, as well as having these what we call co-benefits. So it means that it solves both the problems of climate partially, as well as dealing with other human impacts such as overfishing. So there are benefits in any way. But then those interventions that you mentioned, such as ocean fertilization, is right now there are lots of risk. There may even be impacts on marine ecosystems that we're able to help with the climate problem, but then we may actually create problems for the oceans by doing those kind of interventions. So it means that at least at the current stage, those are the things that we shouldn't pursue unless we have much better understanding about the effects of those interventions. But rather, we should do these kind of nature-based solutions that try to enhance the capacity of, protect the current capacity of the oceans, which have a lot of co-benefits anyways that we can gain from doing so.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. Well, our next talk is by Dr. Shawn Leroux.
Thank you, Diane. Today I'm going to talk about managing biodiversity as a natural solution to climate change. Biodiversity decline and climate change threaten humanity. We've seen these two themes come out throughout this session already. We often manage these problems separately, though. When we look at these problems, we have global agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, where signatory nations like Canada have come together and come up with guidelines and actions to curb biodiversity decline in this case. We look at the climate angle. There are also global agreements, such as the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement, which has come where signatory nations like Canada have come together and developed guidelines and actions to tackle climate change. What's clear is that scientific evidence now shows that biodiversity and climate change are occurring in tandem, so it's time to start thinking about these things at the same time. One way to do this, I propose, is to think about biodiversity management as a climate solution. We know that plant-animal interactions can have positive or negative effects on carbon sequestration or flux. So here's an example from a boreal forest of Canada. We have moose here as a common herbivore, large herbivore that occurs across the boreal region. When moose are in high densities, so let's say 2 individuals per square kilometer, we know that they can feed on a lot of plant material. So as they feed on this plant material, we have high numbers of moose. We're going to see that there's less carbon bound up in those trees and soils in boreal environments compared to if they were in lower densities. What's particularly important is that these effects can span whole landscapes or really large scales. So the image on the bottom here demonstrates this. We're at high densities of moose. So for example, maybe where we have no natural predators for them, we can see that they can have an influence on reducing the amount of carbon that is bound up in forests through trees and in soils at very large extents. So I propose that biodiversity management, similar to William here, can help curb both of these challenges, biodiversity decline and help mitigate climate change. So what does biodiversity management look like? It can have a number of different strategies, one of them being establishment of protected areas. By doing that, we might be conserving and protecting biodiversity. and locking up carbon for long terms in these, let's say, forested environments. It might look like sustainable harvest. So how do we harvest our tree species, animal species, and do so to allow for that resource to be available in the long term? And it might look like restoration. So this is where we might take strategies to bring an ecosystem back to its natural state by either, for example, planting trees, reintroducing animals that were there originally. The United Nations has declared this decade the decade of ecosystem restoration. So all these strategies for biodiversity management must be done based on scientific evidence and with local communities in order to be successful.
Thank you for that talk. Our first question is going to come from Dr. Bastien Mérigot.
Thank you, Shawn. From a quantitative point of view, how much CO2 is expected to be sequestrated with this kind of biodiversity management?
Thanks for your question, Bastien. I think what's clear is that biodiversity management is one solution to climate change. I don't think it's the only solution. I think we need to take a holistic approach to this problem if we're going to achieve success and mitigate climate change. But we do know from the evidence that managing biodiversity can have significant effects on carbon sequestration. So if we take an example of a boreal forest again, there are studies that demonstrate that if we manage moose populations at low densities, so we could do that through managing predators, parasites, hunting. Compared to high densities, we know that at low densities, this could achieve about 40 to 90% of the total emissions from Canada in 1 year. So this is just one example of managing one part of biodiversity with its potential quantitative effects on carbon sequestration. I think to get back to something William had mentioned is this dual benefit where not only is managing biodiversity having potential to make significant climate gains, but it also allows us to maintain biodiversity, which provides a number of services such as food and fresh water for humanity.
Okay, thank you, Shawn.
And our second question comes from Dr. William Cheung.
Thank you very much, Shawn. My question is, are there cases where solutions that more specifically targeting climate mitigations may actually have negative consequences on biodiversity? And so how we should resolve those kind of negative consequences?
Thanks for your question, William. And yes, there are cases where by trying to manage biodiversity, we might have negative effects on biodiversity. Trying to manage biodiversity for climate change might have negative effects on biodiversity and or climate change. One example might be if we're looking to restore a system back to its original state or benchmark state. If we are planting non-native species, so maybe we were looking to replant trees in order to sequester carbon in trees or reintroduce species that might have gone extinct. If we do that by introducing species that are not native to an area, we know that this can have significant negative effects on local and native biodiversity. So one way to get around that is to really work with local communities who have that knowledge about what constitutes a benchmark or a system and a goal that we want to achieve in terms of biodiversity, and find out what are the native species in an area and plant those native species to achieve sort of positive effects.
Thanks. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Nancy Shackell.
Well, thank you, Diane. I'm going to close off the lightning talks by talking about biodiversity and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what are the UN Sustainable Development Goals? These are commonly referred to as SDGs or global goals, and they arose out of the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. And they crafted 17 global goals as a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all by 2030. So this UN resolution is often referred to as the 2030 Agenda. And you can look and you can see that it is all encompassing. So we start from the first goal of no poverty. We move along zero hunger, gender equality, clean water, sanitation. And then finally, down at the very bottom, we see climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and 17 partnerships for the goals. Now, the way that relates was put together by the Stockholm Resilience Center, who rearranged the global goals to show that the biosphere and climate action are really the basis of sustaining our society, which will in turn sustain our economy. So in essence, the global healthy ecosystems are the key to sustainable economies. And this is more and more being recognized by high-level governments and is sort of written into many of the UN's agendas. For example, we see all these, the decade that Shawn just mentioned. And in addition, there's sort of the recognition that at least for the ocean, there are over 3 billion people that depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. So it really is the base of how we can function sustainably as a global community. So what that UN resolution really does for us is it provides a roadmap for the global community in terms of species, ecosystems, and communities, as well as integrating the climate change into the policies and the strategies for resource management and conservation. So finally, where does the research on biodiversity that we've just all seen, you could see little bits of it throughout all of the talks of how that would lead into policy making. We need that evidence base, we need the information, we need all of the sort of quantification and predictions that come from the research on biodiversity that feeds into policy making. The governments and ministries respond. And then of course, the hardest part, which would be the implementation from local governments, the private sector, and the community. So at least from a very broad view, the UN member nations, at least 193, have committed to these global goals, and each nation then develops a strategy towards that. And in Canada, we have what's called the Towards Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy. And that's about it.
Thank you very much for that talk. We have a first question coming up from Dr. Shawn Leroux.
Thank you, Nancy. I think you demonstrated how these global agreements are really fundamental for setting not only global goals and actions, but also at the more local government scale. I'm wondering if you might be able to give us some ideas on what, as individuals, what we might be able to do to contribute to sustainability goals.
Right. Well, the UN Sustainability Development Group has actually created a page of individual action for all of the 17 goals. So for example, for the goal that's related to ocean sustainability, they recommend that individuals stop using plastic bags or start using laundry strips instead of the large baskets. And those are great, but probably the most strongest powerful action to me, in my opinion, is the action we take as individuals to support non-governmental organizations or NGOs. I'm sure many of you are familiar that NGOs are almost always underfunded, but the work they do is invaluable, both in sort of keeping our governments on track to their international commitments, also keeping them accountable, but also amplifying the science behind all the biodiversity conservation that leads to public support, that leads to government action. So here in Canada, as an example, after we committed to the ICEE biodiversity target, we had a deadline of 10% by 2020 in the marine realm. And indeed, a lot of the groundswell generated by NGOs allowed Canada to go from 1 to 13.74. But I guess another point I wanted to make, that the limiting the support of NGOs doesn't really have to be limited to just conservation, but can extend to NGOs working on human rights, just because we're so intricately tied to the natural environment in terms of sustainability. As an example, in Canada, Indigenous leaders and activists have worked really hard to influence change, and we have government policies, but they're not always, they're falling behind in the operationalization of these policies. So we have a lot of examples of how locally we can support NGOs, both on the human rights and the civil rights. So in closing, I guess I just want to say that the NGOs, all branches, are a very good way that us as individuals can support their work and how they can influence the government in a progressive manner. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And another question from Dr. Nicolas Loeuille.
Thanks, Nancy, for the nice talk. My question is about spatial scales. So it seems to me that biodiversity issues often require considering large scales, very large scales, and that sometimes decisions are taken at smaller scales, and that may lead to tragedy of the common, where actually deciding units may benefit from overexploiting biodiversity resources. I was wondering how the UN program tackles this kind of spatial scale issue.
Well, I think it extends beyond biodiversity in terms of the UN experience. The UN high-level policy forums are experts at resolutions, and there's a lot to draw on from that experience outside of biodiversity or outside of anything to do with the natural environment. But from what I get, this would be my opinion, is that the UN provides a roadmap, and then each member country goes through their national exercise to map their current policies against the agenda. And they make up indicators of achieving them. But we already have almost, in many instances, we do have sort of international frameworks or bilateral cooperation. They don't always work that well, but having sort of the UN support these bilateral agreements is a way to get things done. So whereas they can resolve things at a very high level, you're right, at the local level, it does have to come from to sort of nation to nation. And that, that's conditional on a number of factors. As another example, US and Canadian government fisheries agencies responsible for ocean management have sort of long recognized the need to work. We've got this transboundary border on the ocean on both coasts, and we've done it formally and informally. But having the UN agenda and having the UN Decade of Ocean, it sort of gives us another platform for cooperation that leads to funding allocations and focus in order to meet those commitments. But a really important part is that in any bilateral cooperation, it always is going to depend on the political climate, and those have to be aligned, which we have recently had. So on a good front, I expect to see lots of action. We should expect to see lots of action in the next 4 years. So thanks for that.
And that's a wonderful positive note to start wrapping things up on. What we've seen over these series of discussions is we started off talking about some of the challenges, about the effects of global change on ecosystems and biodiversity. And a real theme that came out in that first series of talks was that the challenges are sometimes greater than we might imagine at first glance. And that's because of the interconnectedness of ecosystems through some of the fluxes, as well as the interconnectedness of species, how changes in, for example, the genetic character of certain species affect their interactions with other species. And then in terms of the solutions, we also learned that a lot of the solutions were also influenced by the interconnectedness. That's perhaps we shouldn't be considering the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis as two separate crises, and instead we needed to perhaps think about how one influences the other. And then in Dr. Shackell's talk, we even thought about the interconnectedness of solving some of the environmental issues in concert with some of the societal issues at the same time. So thank you. I'd like to thank all the participants for all their insights today. And I'm sure many of those in the live audience have questions of their own that they'd like to ask some of the participants. So we'll now change over to that. Thank you, everybody.